Justice. Everyone's talking about it, fighting for it, demanding it. But here's the problem. When the world uses the word justice, it doesn't always mean what Scripture means. And if we don't recognize that, we'll assume we're all having the same conversation, when we're actually standing on completely different foundations. Welcome back to Project Aletheia. Today we're diving into a question that's as old as the hills and yet feels urgently new. What is justice? We live in a world that's obsessed with it. You can see it in courtrooms, cancellations, and protests in the streets. Everybody claims to be on the side of justice, but open the scriptures and you suddenly realize we might not all be talking about the same thing. One version of justice demands retribution, public shaming, and the balancing of scales by any means necessary. The other version of justice looks like a bleeding Middle Eastern man nailed to a Roman cross, whispering, "Father, forgive me." One is fueled by outrage and power. The other is fueled by mercy and sacrifice. The world says, "Pay what you owe." The other says, "I will pay what you owe, even though I have never sinned." Worldly justice says that the victim gets the final word. Biblical justice says the victim already had the final word, and it was grace. So which one is right? Can they coexist? Should they? And what happens when the church confuses the two? I will be contrasting biblical justice and worldly justice. Where they clash, where they surprisingly overlap, and why getting this wrong might be the most dangerous mistake of our generation. Let's begin. What is justice without morals? How you define morals determines the outcome. So who is defining the morals that we are judged by? Scripture doesn't leave us guessing. God actually gives specific instructions about what justice looks like. Biblical justice is defined by God's morals found in Scripture, and worldly justice is defined by man's shifting morals. God's scales are just. They are set up in a way that ensures fair treatment for everyone. Ezekiel gives specific instructions to Israel's leaders to stop oppression and use honest scales and measures, emphasizing that God's justice is rooted in fairness and righteousness. God demanded integrity in the very systems that determined what was fair. A reminder that his standards don't shift with culture. There are 3 examples of biblical justice that I want to look at. You've probably heard of these, but they have been misunderstood for a while. The first is turning the other cheek. In first century culture, if someone gave you a backhanded slap, it was their way of saying that you were below them. Turning your cheek would make you face your opponent, making you be seen as equal. The second one is walking 2 miles. A Roman soldier could force you to walk a mile. If you carried the soldier's equipment for an extra mile, though, the soldier would be humiliated. Finally, when Jesus said that if someone asked for your tunic, to give them your cloak as well, this would leave you naked, but the shame would be put on those looking, not on the one without clothes. Notice what all these examples have in common. They flip power dynamics without violence or revenge. So Jesus gives us a blueprint for justice that is bold, disruptive, and deeply rooted in righteousness. But here's where things get tricky. The modern justice movement doesn't use the same blueprint. This tension between Jesus' vision of justice and the modern one is exactly what many thinkers have been warning about. The late Voddie Baucham talks about this in his excellent book Fault Lines, where he warns about a different gospel creeping into the church. Let me break down what Baucham means, because this part is huge. The difficulty with social justice is that it appears to be virtuous and it sounds Christian when it's being employed by Christian leaders. However, social justice is one of the most devious and destructive movements the church has faced in the last 100 years. He points out that social justice doesn't see original sin as the individual's heart, but about institutional or structural racism as the primary sin. The gospel of critical social justice is seen as anti-racism, and the goal is equity, meaning equal outcomes and redistribution, rather than biblical reconciliation or individual righteousness. Baucham points out that CSJ establishes its own canon of accepted teachings and voices, often displacing the sufficiency of Scripture. This movement gave rise to a group called social justice warriors. They deemed themselves to be tolerant until you disagree with their worldview. Once you deviate from it, their tolerance disappears, and a bunch of ism and ist labels will come at you. It's ironic, really. The areas of concern are always shifting. Naturally, confusion arises and leads to division. Now, before I go full scorched earth on social justice, hold on. But fairness also requires honesty. So before we paint with too broad a brush, there is overlap, and it's important to acknowledge that. Both systems acknowledge the deep suffering and inequality we see around us. Biblical justice, based on God's commands, really emphasizes looking after those who are poor, widows, and orphans, people who are often left behind in Scripture. Social justice movements also aim to support those who don't have the power or resources they need. They both agree that things like oppression, theft, exploitation, and abuse are not okay. Worldly justice see these issues as coming from the system and structures we have, while biblical justice focuses on the sin in each person's heart. But both are reacting to the consequences of that sin, suffering, and unfairness. Ultimately, both justice systems want to make things right. Christians are encouraged to work towards reconciliation and being righteous in their own lives, while social activists are called to create equity and share resources more fairly. But what they both share is a strong commitment to taking action. This illustrates how reducing every conflict to oppressor versus oppressed misses the nuances of human sin and history. Now let's bring this into a concrete setting of our modern justice system. A man is walking home late at night. Someone jumps him from behind, beats him, steals his wallet, and leaves him bleeding in an alley. No politics, no theories, just a clear moral wrong. Everyone would agree that this is wrong. But watch how the conversation changes depending on which justice lens you're looking through. Our justice system would ask questions about the attacker's economic status, color of his skin, or if he was part of a minority or not. In some frameworks, the moral weight shifts away from the personal act and onto society at large. In others, guilt can be softened or intensified based on group identity instead of the individual's choice. Eventually, justice becomes less about what happened in that alley and more about the narratives society wants to promote. The victim's pain becomes a data point, the attacker becomes a symbol, and the goal becomes rebalancing power, not restoring what was actually broken. Because worldly justice moves with culture, the verdict can change depending on who is telling the story. The same crime can be condemned in one news cycle and excused in the next. It's a justice system built on sand. Generally, the justice system will look at a criminal with more leniency than they should. A serious crime either gets a slap on the wrist or lighter consequences than expected, and people feel the system is cracked, no matter what side they're on. There is also the occasion where the same offender serves a sentence and is released only to reoffend a short time later. And here's where another problem shows up. When people lose trust in the justice system, they don't just become frustrated, they become vigilantes. This happens when the courts seem inconsistent and criminals get a slap on the wrist, the innocent get ignored, and people start saying, "Fine, if the system won't fix this, I will." We see it everywhere. Citizens taking justice into their own hands, mobs forming online, people publicly shaming others, doxing them, hunting them down, and exposing them. It's vigilante justice dressed up as righteousness. But here's the thing, vigilantes aren't driven by holiness, they're driven by anger, fear, and the desire to balance the scales themselves. It's justice without God, judgment without mercy, and it proves exactly what happens when justice is built on shifting human standards. Everyone becomes their own judge, jury, and executioner. Biblical justice doesn't need vigilantes because it doesn't rely on human outrage to work. It calls people back to God's standard instead of pushing them toward revenge. Biblical justice works in the opposite direction. It flows from God's character, not social narratives. The primary focus is on the heart of the person committing the act. It names the act as sin, placing the moral responsibility on the attacker. It recognizes that all have sinned and need redemption. But Scripture calls us in the complete opposite direction. We see this in Romans 12:14. The context is talking about people who are being persecuted. God instructs them to do what they can to live peaceably with everyone, as far as it depends on them. He instructs them to not avenge themselves, but assures them that He will repay, because vengeance is His. This is what separates biblical justice from worldly. Verse 20 says, "To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Here's the key difference. Worldly justice can punish, but it cannot redeem. Biblical justice can do both. This tension isn't new. Jesus actually tells a story that mirrors this dynamic. The example I used earlier was a modern take on the Good Samaritan story. The religious leaders and the priests who should have helped walked right by. The twist comes when the least expected person comes along who should have stayed away, coming to redeem the situation. The Samaritan. He doesn't ask questions. Instead, he puts the man on his own donkey and takes the man to be taken care of by a doctor, willing to pay whatever it takes to make the man whole. This is biblical justice on display. So, with all that in mind, here's where this leaves us. While the two forms of justice may overlap In acknowledging the suffering and inequality we see around us, we must always check the source and the solution. Biblical justice calls us to reconciliation and individual righteousness rooted in the finished work of Christ. Worldly justice calls for equity and redistribution rooted in man's shifting morals. When the church confuses the two, trading the grace-centered justice of the cross for the outrage-fueled justice of the world, we risk displacing the sufficiency of Scripture and committing the most dangerous mistake of our generation. Both claim to pursue justice, but only one leads to redemption. So here's the question for you. Which justice are you being shaped by? The justice of the cross or the justice of the crowd? Thank you for joining me on this journey. Every week, we uncover more of God's truth hidden in plain sight, and every step brings us closer to the one who is true. Until next time, keep your heart anchored in Scripture, your eyes open to the world around you, and your hands ready to live out what you have learned. If this episode helped you, share it with someone. And if you've got a topic you want me to explore, you can reach me through the links in the show notes. Now go take a nap. Jesus did.